Morning, everyone. Thanks for taking your time this morning to hear us talk about renewable projects on island. I'm going to set a bit of the broader sort of context in which Manx Utilities are delivering the onshore renewables. Ultimately, they're sort of responsible for the delivery side of things, and we're setting the overall overarching policy framework around that. I can talk for 10, 15 minutes, and then apologies, got to dash off because I'm doing another talk at 10 on energy efficiency and the future of heat, if anyone fancies coming to that. So apologies, I can't be there for Q&A, but I'll be around most of the day, so if anyone wants to chat, I'll be happy to do so. So there's kind of three broad kind of categories of thematic categories that were stewing around in the back of our minds when we were developing the recently published energy strategy. And I'll talk through all of those and talk to you about how they influence the development of that policy area and ultimately how that feeds into the renewable projects that Lizzie will talk to you about. So the first one is ultimately climate change, global warming. September, well, since June, it's been the record greatest anomaly against historical baselines since 1850. We're seeing potentially accelerated warming at the moment. There's a range of natural and also anthropogenic factors that's underlying that, but we're seeing very significant levels of warming at the moment, and potentially September will see us reach 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial baseline for the first time, the sort of canonical Paris Agreement temperature targets. That doesn't mean the temperature target's breached, but it hits that limit for the first time. So we're seeing severe levels of warming, and every increment of warming up to around 4 degrees, projected 4 degrees of warming, sees increased impacts on people, ecosystems, and the economy, society in general. And somewhere, at the moment, we're somewhere heading, our current policies take us to somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees, a level of warming that hasn't been seen for around 3 million years ago. So there's that climate change imperative that underlies all of our policies and that net zero ambition that we have in place for 2050. Feeding off from that, we have the broader kind of economic rationale and desire to decarbonise. So the figure on the far right of the screen is part of the economic strategy, and that was very much seeing the investment and economic benefits from the drive to decarbonisation and the increase in sustainability of our economy, and that was central and at the heart of the economic strategy, and the purpose of the energy strategy is to support that policy goal. And so you can see from the underlying KPMG report, the Isle of Man doesn't do great in terms of renewable energy production or low-carbon energy production in general compared to a number of our comparator jurisdictions. Similarly, we have quite high per capita emissions, and so there's a real need to decarbonise the economy to meet those the economic imperative to decarbonise. And this is an issue that isn't going away. I screen grabbed the G20 leaders' declaration from a couple of weeks ago, which committed the G20 nations to a trebling of renewable capacity by 2030. So this is an ongoing imperative. And I suspect many of you will have seen the announcements from the UK yesterday on their lowering of ambition in certain policy areas, but buried within that statement from the UK Prime Minister was a series of policies that will actually accelerate renewable rollout and support greater acceleration of renewable deployment. So this is very much a set of global trends that that the economic strategy sought to align us with, and that we, on the energy policy side, are seeking to support. And then thirdly, and this has become more acute since, unsurprisingly, the Ukraine invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Sort of historically, there's been much more of a focus in energy policy, or at least in the sort of last 10 or so years. If you think of the conventional energy trilemma of environment, cost, and security, I think it's fair to say there's been a greater focus on the economic and environmental aspects of that, with less of a focus on the security of supply element, but that's very much come into sharper focus in recent months. And while the volatility in markets has significantly reduced since the initial invasion of Ukraine, and you don't want to oversell the risks that we face in terms of security of supply, nonetheless there remains a degree of market volatility that has impacted the policy making that we've been doing. So those are sort of three of the broad thematic areas that we've been thinking about in the development of the energy policy and energy strategy. And this can kind of be summarised on this single slide as essentially a set of problems and challenges that we're seeking to overcome, as well as some opportunities as well. So we've got a fossil fuel dominated energy mix and a need to decarbonise in order to meet our climate change targets, make a contribution to global efforts on climate change, and position ourselves as a responsible nation that contributes to solving those problems. On the positive side, we have a very high level of grid stability and resilience, a point that I'll come on to again shortly. We're largely import dependent for our energy. And as I say, historically, that's not necessarily been seen as a particular issue, but more recently, we've all seen the consequences of that in terms of our energy bills. We've got businesses struggling to meet ESG targets, and we know for certain that that's impacted on investment on island because they're not able to demonstrate that they can source renewable low-carbon power on island. And ultimately, this is set again in the context of requiring major investment needs against a broader backdrop of economic pressure. And it's worth noting that those major investment needs happen regardless of if we were decarbonising. So there's a need to invest in the power system to replace the existing fleet at some point in the not too distant future. So there's big investment requirements regardless of our future energy trajectory. We do have a number of ambitious targets and actions in place. So we're progressing the development of the onshore wind and solar projects, very much feeding out of those energy policy discussions that I've just mentioned now. We have emission reduction targets in place for interim targets for 2030, 2035 and 2050, ultimately the net zero target by 2050. And we're targeting zero carbon power supply by 2030. And that's actually a really ambitious goal, and would put us ahead of pretty much anywhere else in the world were we to be able to achieve that. And again, that would hopefully support those business investment decisions from the ESG perspective. We've committed to no further hydrocarbon exploration beyond the existing licence that DOI have with Crookall. And we have the lease for offshore wind with Ørsted, which there's a lot of work going on at the moment to progress the development of that. And as a sort of interim solution to meet those business ESG needs, Manx Utilities have been working on development of REGOs, so the ability to demonstrate that you're sourcing renewable power from the UK. So we've recognised all of those different factors that are feeding into the debate, and we're trying to reflect those in a set of targets and actions, as well as the energy strategy, which was recently published. On the subject of which, the energy strategy came out in June, I think it was, earlier this year. And that has, I'll cover that in the next few slides. And again, that sets the sort of policy context in which Manx Utilities are then delivering the renewables projects on island. But ultimately, the vision for the vision that the energy strategy sets out is the island's energy future is one in which our net zero ambition supports the economic strategy, takes advantage of low carbon technologies, optimises our own abundant natural resource to make us more independent and prosperous. And it has below that overarching vision a set of goals, which I'll just briefly talk you through at the moment, talk you through now. So as I've mentioned, a key plank of the energy strategy and our energy policy is to support the island plan and the economic strategy. And it's to think of ways in which we can help use energy policy and deploy our energy policy tools to support economic growth. Similarly, how can we deploy those tools to support the delivery of the island's net zero targets? The third point is my attempt to explain the fact that when we're designing energy policy, we're trying to think about it in the most sort of economically holistic way as we possibly can. So it's not just about pence per kilowatt hours on your bills, although that's an absolutely key factor in it, but it's also about what the impacts and consequences our actions have on the wider business and economic, wider business sector and the economy as a whole. So it's trying to think about the impacts of our policies in those sort of general rounded terms. It's to ensure that the energy transition occurs in a way that's as fair and equitable as possible. And similarly to ensure, again, that people and businesses are able to benefit from decarbonisation. And then both interlinked with each other and reflecting those increased concerns about energy security we're keen to make better and greater use of our own energy resources on island, of which we have potentially a fairly great abundance, and to increase our energy independence to the extent that it's reasonable to do so. And then the final point is, it's very important to maintain the island's existing levels of power system resilience. We're very fortunate here that Manx Utilities do a really incredible job of basically keeping the lights on, which we to some extent take for granted. But if you compare to other jurisdictions, they have a much less reliable track record of power system resilience. And so all of the work that Manx Utilities have been doing and thinking about, and Lizzie will introduce to you later on in the next section, is very much driven by an evidence base that will allow us to support continued resilience of our power system. So to wrap up, I will talk you through the 6 principal areas of the energy strategy. So it's important to recognise that it's not, at this stage, generally not a detailed set of policy actions. It's more a set of policy principles that provides a framework in which subsequent policy decisions can then be made. So it sets that overarching framework in which we then operate, and sets, I hope, a clear sense and direction of travel for the island, and makes it abundantly clear which route we're going in, while we continue to develop more specific policies and flesh them out in each of the different thematic areas. And we're committed to producing an annual update that show progress and continued policy development every year. So the next iteration should be out next summer. So the first policy area and first policy principle, is that we're going to increase our energy independence and security through on-island renewables and carbon-neutral energy generation, hence the projects that Lizzie will talk to you about after me. So it's using our own abundant natural resources to increase our energy independence, increase energy security, and ultimately make our contribution to hitting those climate targets. Related to that, however, is, and this is a slightly kind of vague way of framing it, but we'll optimise the level of on-island renewables and carbon-neutral energy generation. It's essentially to say we'll do number 1 right up to the point in which it's not sensible to do any more of number 1 for either cost reasons. We know that building huge amounts of renewable capacity on island, while that might bring us greater energy independence, would come at greater cost. We know that that will come with greater environmental impacts, for example. So it's about trying to find a balance between all those different competing, intersecting pressures and come up with a power system that balances all these different benefits and trade-offs against each other. And again, part of the work that I'll be doing with Council of Ministers over the next year or so will be trying to define what our exact vision of that future power system looks like. But there's an example that Lizzie will talk about, the roadmap that Manx Utilities have developed, which is very much based on the kind of best available evidence and evidence collection actually since sort of 2010, but accelerated in the last few years. And that sets out the Manx Utilities view of the world of how you might achieve that kind of optimised energy system that balances all these different competing pressures. And so Lizzie will talk you through what that looks like, and that's hopefully a way in which we might achieve a sensible balance between cost, independence, environmental impact, etc. Thirdly, we're keen, as I've mentioned and stressed throughout, that we're keen to provide a supporting environment for business low carbon needs. It's very much come from the perspective of trying to figure out how we can support economic growth through the energy strategy and then working back from there. That's not to say that there won't be constraints and pressures that can't reasonably be overcome, be they costs or grid infrastructure requirements to do so, but nevertheless, the starting point of our policy development will always be to provide a supporting environment for business and help drive investment and drive growth in the economy. We've got a piece in there around offshore wind. So our first goal with that is to support and progress the existing licence with existing agreement for lease with Ørsted and deliver the benefits of that for our community. But we're also working on scoping out a potential future licensing round for offshore wind, and there's a lot of work going on underway as part of that. To support that, we are committed in the energy strategy to developing a marine spatial plan, which will basically say, well, given shipping, given aviation, well, given radar, given wind resource, given biodiversity, given fishing, given visual impact, combine all these things together into a marine spatial plan, and then we can determine just how much we think is appropriate in terms of future seabed leasing and whether that's a route we want to go down. So we're very much starting from the let's deliver with Ørsted first, and then figuring out whether it's appropriate and sensible to do further offshore wind licensing. But that's something that's in the back of our minds and we're working on at the moment. Fifth, the government renewables projects that are being developed and that Lizzie will talk to you about are going to be in public ownership. And the reason for that is fundamentally that it'll deliver lowest cost to the consumer. And that's a conclusion that's been reached on the basis of a considerable amount of market research, independent market research, that demonstrates that government-owned renewables on island will be significantly lower cost than signing long-term power purchase agreements with the private sector. So for this initial batch of renewable development on island, our initial steps in our decarbonisation journey, we're going to be doing that in public ownership. That's not to say we won't keep that under review. We will keep that under review, and there may come a time where capital requirements force us down a different, capital demands force us down a different route. And we're always open to conversations with the private sector, but nevertheless, that's very much the perspective for our first projects. And then finally, it's around enabling consumers to take advantage of the net zero transition. And this is where the strategy starts to interlink with some of the other sectors of the economy that we're seeking to decarbonise. And I'll be talking a bit about that at 10 in terms of heat. But this is very much thinking around issues of the net zero home of the future, which hopefully will see lower operating costs, comfier, warmer homes, and flexible, if desired, flexible levels of power usage that also complement Manx Utilities' requirements to decarbonise the grid in a cost-optimal manner, shifting demand over the course of the day, reducing the overall cost of system transition, those sorts of things. And so we're very much focused on that now, and the heat work that I'm doing and the development of the heat strategy complements that. So hopefully everything's starting to cohere together as well. So I think that's my piece. As I say, I have to dash off to another talk now, but I'll be very much sort of around during the course of the day if anyone wants to grab me. Hopefully that sets the context, the policy context in which we're operating in, and which Lizzie and Manx Utilities are then delivering the specific projects that you'll hear about now. So over to you, Lizzie. Thank you, everyone.
Is that okay? Hopefully everyone can hear me. The transition programme at Manx Utilities was established while the climate plan was being developed back in 2022. We saw a need that we were going to have to set up a programme to be able to deliver all of these projects that were coming out of the policy that Steve's just been talking to you about. So we have many projects. I know that there's some big news items at the moment, but we're actually trying to deliver everything that will enable us to reach our target of net zero electricity by 2030. If we start at 2022 and where we were then, we had around 4 to 5 megawatts of solar generation already on our power system. So that's from domestic and commercial ownership, behind the meter installations, what we might see on people's houses. As we move forward now towards 2026, the first schemes that we might see being deployed are public solar. So we're looking to roll out up to 10 megawatts of solar across the public estate, be it on rooftops, car parks, and we're targeting the buildings which have got the largest generation potential, because hopefully that will provide the lowest possible cost for the customer. Beyond that, by 2026, again, we have a target to deliver 20 megawatts of onshore wind on the Isle of Man. And as Steve's mentioned, that will be in public ownership. At that point, we'll start to potentially integrate our renewable project with the rollout of our smart metering programme and start to work on developing our smart grid. Beyond 2026, we're then looking to deploy a second interconnector between the Isle of Man and GB. So we've done that. That will deliver security of supply beyond 2030. And if we do that, we would approximately reduce our emissions to 90%, which is great, but our target is 100%. So we've recognised the need to have some additional on-island, on-demand generation, which is the green one you can see at the end after 2030. And And if we do that, that gives us the opportunity to generate 100% of our emissions on island. There's then further opportunity to integrate or link into some offshore energy projects. So we see a really good potential to link into those projects. We don't think it's going to be possible before 2030, but it is an excellent opportunity for the Isle of Man. Beyond 2030, there are multiple avenues which we could explore as an island for economic advantage. So we have investigated other technologies such as carbon neutral baseload options. We're looking at storage and hybrid renewable options and additional renewables onto the system beyond that level. But technology is constantly shifting, and there's many technologies which are not currently commercially viable, which may become so in the future. So I suppose the point post-2030 is everything is possible at this point in time, and we'll continue to watch how technology shifts in the future. So just to give you a recap of what Steve's been talking about, policy is set by Isle of Man government, not Manx Utilities. Our role is to deliver on the policy objectives and the targets that have been set. So the key targets that relate to our future energy plans are from initially the climate plan 2022 to 2027. So the first target or the key target for us is that we have to achieve 100% decarbonised electricity by 2030. We also have to have at least 20 megawatts of onshore renewables on the Isle of Man. And in order to achieve that 100% decarbonisation, we need a second interconnector in place. And that meets our security of supply requirement. We've also recently had the the island plan. Council of Ministers have set 2 targets for us within that island plan. First, we have to deliver 20 megawatts of onshore wind by 2026. And again, that will be publicly owned. And we also have to deliver 10 megawatts of public solar. And all of the targets are now supported by Steve's energy strategy as well. So a bit of background to energy supply on the Isle of Man as it stands today and what we need to maintain in the future. At the moment, we have 3 main ways that we can meet island demand. Island demand is typically, on average, 40 megawatts across the year, but it does peak at 75 megawatts in winter, around 5 to 7 p.m. And we have to be able to deliver enough power to meet that demand at all times. So if we look at the first or usual source of generation on island, it's the combined cycle gas turbine plant in Pulrose. 2 gas turbines, which are both capable of delivering up to 60 megawatts, and we take the waste heat from those gas turbines and convert it into electricity via a steam turbine, and that gives us 80 megawatts, so enough to meet demand. We then also have 2 backup generators on island, or 2 backup stations. One is in the Douglas area and one is in Peel, and that consists of up to just under 90 megawatts of diesel generators. We don't tend to use them. It's not economic, it's not great for the environment, but the key role of those generators is that if we ever did have a blackout on island at any time, those pieces of plant are the only things that can restart our power system at this point in time. So we talk about the gas turbines are there. They actually would need the grid to be operating in order to be able to supply power into the networks. The diesels are critical for security of supply, even if we don't currently use them. And finally, we also have the interconnector into GB, so an electricity interconnector. It's 60 megawatts. It's not currently enough to meet peak demand at all times, but most of the time it can provide us with all of our power needs. And the other key aspect of that interconnector is it's an HVAC interconnector, which is quite unusual for some jurisdictions. It means we are tied into the stability of the UK's power system. So whichever direction the UK's power system goes, we go with it. We can't control what the UK grid is doing. And actually, regardless of what plant we have running on island, it's the interconnector that provides the stability to our power system. Without the interconnector in service, we can't operate the combined cycle gas turbine at full power. We have to utilise the diesels to keep the lights on. And that's important for our future energy considerations as well. We do have 2 other plants on island as well. We have a hydro at Solby, which can output 1 megawatt of generation. Typically doesn't run very often. We don't get enough rainfall to keep it in service all year round. So tends to run around 4 months of the year over the winter periods. And it is the cheapest source of electricity on our power system today. We've already paid it off, so we only have small amounts of operational and maintenance costs associated with it. We also have power that we take from the energy from waste plant. So electricity is a byproduct of waste burning, and that's the key role of that business. So it actually can produce very low-cost electricity for us, and we also have a duty to take any power that plant puts out on a daily basis. And that can deliver up to 6 megawatts. It doesn't always, it typically runs around 2 megawatts, 2.5 megawatts, but if it is generating, we have a duty to take power from it. Back to the energy trilemma. So we have an obligation under the Electricity Act 1996 to maintain a balance of security of supply, affordability, and consider the environment. So in terms of security of supply, Steve's mentioned we have one of the most secure power systems in Europe. It's really been important to our island over the last 20 years. And just to put what that means in perspective, we haven't had a blackout on the island, and I mean a blackout, a total system power loss, since 1996. That's very unusual. The UK came very close to having a half-system blackout in 2019. Ireland's had 5. The other Channel Islands have also lost power recently. So that is a really secure power system, and we do take it for granted. But it is a factor of having all of those layers of backup, and they're available at all times, really. In terms of affordability, we do have a duty to provide the lowest possible cost to customers. So whatever technology produces the lowest power or the lowest cost power on a daily basis, we will use. If the interconnector or importing electricity from the UK is lower cost than anything on island, that's what we will be using. And in terms of the environmental impacts of supply, yes, we have to reduce our carbon footprint. Yes, we have to meet the targets that have been set by Isle of Man government, but there are other things we have to consider with the environment. So if we think of Pulrose today, yes, it's emitting a lot of carbon dioxide, but it does also emit other pollutants such as nitrous oxide, and the diesels emit sulfur dioxide, which are not great for health. So reducing our use of those items of plant is also better generally for the environment and not just for the climate. We've also got another 3 areas that are putting pressure on that trilemma at the moment. So the first is a drive for greater independence, which has come out of the energy crisis. But with greater independence comes higher cost of electricity. So there's a balancing point. With the ESG targets in business, there's a drive to see a greater level of renewables on the grid, but there's a point where if you have too much renewables on the grid, you lose system stability. And finally, with the energy crisis, I think a lot of people are a lot more concerned about the cost of electricity than they have been previously. And it's focused how we're using electricity today. So in terms of our role in meeting security of supply standards, this is how demand varies across the year. We have to be able to meet demand at all times. Demand is typically highest in the winter months. And if we think about it, it makes sense. We use lights a lot more in the winter because it's darker. We tend to put electric heating on or use electric showers in winter a lot more frequently. In the future, if we've switched to air source heat pumps, they will not be used in summer months on the whole, apart from water heating. So we're going to see the future growth in electricity in the winter months. Summer demand on island is fairly low. We don't tend to use much power across the summer months. And in the future, we're not necessarily expecting demand to rise in the summer because unlike the UK, we're not expecting to see a lot or large amount of growth in air conditioning. Temperatures on island are not necessarily predicted to increase radically. But we still have to be able to meet this demand profile at all times with whatever technology is available to us. In terms of how demand varies across the day, the demand profile is fairly consistent. So if we think about how we use electricity in our own homes, at night, we've probably only got things like our fridges and freezers running. We might have a skybox on standby if we've forgotten to turn it off. And And as we start to wake up around 6 o'clock in the morning and start switching on lights, switching on heating, switching on our kettles, that demand growth starts to increase. And we reach a flat line when we have all of our businesses online and we've started to use computers and things like that. And then there's a further peak in the evening between 5 and 7 o'clock at night where we reach peak demand. And that is associated broadly with cooking. And as we start to tail off into the evening, that demand drops down again. You might start to see some little peaks that are emerging at the start and end of the graph. We believe they're associated with electric vehicle charging because we have a tariff that encourages people to use electricity after midnight. So we are starting to see that trend emerging. This profile is actually summer demand, so 21st of June 2021. And it's a typical demand profile. It's not the lowest use of electricity we see. The winter profile follows it exactly the same, although it's a lot more exaggerated, which makes sense because we use, again, more heating or more electric heating and more lighting in the winter period. And the problem with that consistency is regardless of what sort of generation is available to us, we still have to be able to hit that demand target or the lights will go out. So demand peaks in winter, at the moment, 73 megawatts, 21st of December 2021. And the summer peak, or summer minimum rather, can be lower than 25 megawatts. And our average demand on the whole is around 40 megawatts. Which is a problem because if we're not allowed to use any types of fossil fuel generation in the future on island, and our existing stock is entirely fossil fuel driven, our current capacity of the interconnector does not meet peak demand in winter. So it's not enough. We need to do more to be able to keep security of supply. So the steps needed to maintain security of supply in the future. These are our projected demand forecasts for the future, produced by WSP back in 2022 for us. They are published on our website. And since the energy crisis, we've noticed that demand is not necessarily going to be as large as anticipated in the future. That's broadly because consumer behaviour has significantly changed. People are a lot more conscious of how much electricity they're using. And in addition, technology is evolving as well. So we're getting a lot more smart technology that can try and shift that demand profile and flatten it. So whereas we have previously had demand forecasts of up to 130 megawatts by 2050, we now are seeing forecasts where demand, or the peak demand, is lower than today. That doesn't mean average demand isn't higher because inevitably with greater electrification of heating and transport, we're going to see rise in the overall use of electricity across the year. But the peak doesn't necessarily have to stay the same. But again, it's still a problem because that's the capacity of our existing interconnector. So regardless, we have to do more. And if we look at the availability of technology in terms of what we could actually rely on and hang our hat on that's going to be there to deliver electricity consistently, whether it's windy or sunny, the blocks on the left-hand side of the graph represent what we've currently got today. So the black is an interconnector. You can see it's available broadly around 99% of the year. The only 1% when it's not available is when we take it out for maintenance. We rarely see faults on the interconnector. Typically, we might get a fault 1 in 10 years. So it's a really good standard of security. Going beyond that, we have the CCGT, so that tends to be available around 90% of the time, but it does trip more frequently, so we may see between 2 and 3 trips on the generator per year. Diesels are less reliable, but they're also older. They're obsolete technology, they will need to be replaced, and the positive thing about those 3 elements is that they've got a really, really high availability. Unless there's a genuine equipment fault, which could arise in any technology, they're always there. When we start to think about renewable technologies, we don't have that consistency of availability. It's not always windy, it's not always sunny. So the next best thing in terms of intermittent capacity is offshore wind. So really high load factor, it tends to be windier offshore. So when we may see, capacity factors of around 50% availability, but we need 100% to be able to guarantee security of supply. So it's part of the mix, but won't solve everything. Beyond that, we have onshore wind. So again, really, really good availability for renewable technology, but not going to solve the full picture. The bar, or the second bar from the left, is tidal. It's predictable. We can guarantee when it's going to be producing power, but the problem is it'll only produce power on an incoming or outgoing tide. It doesn't produce power consistently. And that typically only has an availability of around 28% of the time, which is surprising. We hear that the tide is constant, and it is, but it won't always generate power. And lastly, at the very end, we have solar. Only typically has a capacity factor in the British Isles of around 10%, whereas, again, we need 100% to guarantee security of supply. So that's the sort of dilemma that we're dealing with future technologies. We do get asked a lot about storage. So this is an evaluation of what storage potential different technologies have. If we look at the interconnector, or as we have it today, it can be available 352 days a year. And because we're tied into the security of the UK, that effectively gives us storage of 352 days a year. We cannot beat that level of security. Beyond that, you might see that there's a green bar to the left-hand side. That is currently what we have in terms of storage capacity on island in our tanks at Pulrose and Peel. It gives us 12 days of generation capability. So if we ever lost the interconnector or the gas pipeline coming into the UK, we would be able to keep the lights on for 12 days without worrying about it. And then finally, you might see two smaller boxes on the bottom right of the chart. The one on the left is the typical availability or typical capacity of pumped hydro. So that's actually what Dinorwig has in Wales. Typically will last 6 hours. So if you lose Sizewell, Dinorwig will come online and it will run for 6 hours, and that's it. It's not enough to keep the UK going, but it's enough to keep the UK going long enough for it to get additional plant on. And finally, the smallest little square is the current capability of battery storage systems in the UK. So the largest battery storage system actually in Europe is a business called Pillswood. It's got 190 megawatt hours capacity, which on the Isle of Man would last about 3 hours. So it's not enough to keep the lights on. So when people ask why we're going down the route of an interconnector, that's why. There may be a commercial reason for to go into storage, but we're not doing it for security of supply. So hopefully that helps paint the picture of why we're doing what we're doing. We've mentioned we recognise the need for local on-demand generation. We know that these future generators would need to be around 70 megawatts because we have to meet future demands. They would cover an interconnector outage, so planned maintenance on the interconnector. We have two options available to us. We could potentially convert Pulrose, but then we're limited to very, very specific and specialised fuels. And it's not also capable of running on hydrogen if that became an option in the future. New plant or new generators could be adapted to run on anything. So there's advantages to going with new build, but equally there's cost savings potentially in conversion of existing plants. So a balance. We haven't decided what we're doing yet, but that's the areas we're currently exploring. And as I've sort of said, there's really two options for carbon neutral fuel on island at the moment that we would need to use to provide the same role as what the diesels currently do today. They'll start the grid if it ever loses power. One is hydrogen, which is not currently commercially viable, but we're continuing to monitor it. And the other is biofuels. But if we go with biofuels, there's very limited feedstock on island. Approximately, we could only generate around 35 gigawatt hours worth of fuel on island from biofuels. So not enough to meet all of our demands, but it is enough to cover an interconnector outage and potentially provide some peak lopping support, i.e. covering that evening peak at times when there's nothing else available. There could be potential if we had more fuel to run those units for around 100 gigawatt hours, but our typical annual demand is 350 gigawatt hours. So it's not enough to meet what we need, but it is part of the picture. So if we think about the challenges now of trying to introduce renewables to our system, we'll start with the Isle of Man power system as it is today. So if average demand on island is 40 megawatts, there is a sort of natural limit of how many renewables we can have on island, because otherwise we're generating far too much power to meet our needs. So on island use, there's a sort of natural commercial limit for renewables of 40 megawatts. If we could export into the UK, which isn't guaranteed, because if we've got lots of wind and solar, so is the UK, we could increase that to an additional 60 megawatts and export it, but again, not guaranteed. So that gives us a rough capacity at the moment of around 100 megawatts that we could accommodate on the system. All of that power could be accommodated in the Douglas area, and that's for a good reason. If you think about how the power system has been designed, it's concentrated and focused around where we have the most residents and where we have the most need for electricity. As we move away from that Douglas demand centre, we start to lose strength in the power system. And I don't mean that in the sense that the power is at risk in other areas of the grid. It's just that we don't need our cables to be so big to transfer the power because people don't live there. So in terms of generation capacity, as I say, moving away from Douglas, it's harder and harder to introduce renewables to the network in those areas. The northern area of the network is particularly problematic, so we can't, in all fault scenarios, have 20 megawatts of renewables in that area of the grid. The southern area of the power system is a lot better, so we can have 20 megawatts in that area of the grid. But if we want to do more than 20, we're going to struggle to accommodate it if we want to spread those resources across the island at the moment. Once we get the second interconnector, that potentially allows us to increase the renewables on the system another 70 megawatts or up to 100 megawatts, depending on the capacity of the second interconnector, providing we can export it. But the real benefit of the interconnector in terms of renewables and stability of the system is this is what happens to the level of renewables we can accommodate when we lose the interconnector. So we can't have more than 8.5 megawatts of renewables on the power system without an interconnector because we will completely lose stability. So that's the natural limit, and that's where they are limited to in an interconnector outage. Having a second interconnector reduces the likelihood of that event ever happening, which is great. That's why we talk about security of supply. It's less than 1% of the year when this event would happen, so we can naturally curtail off our renewables, but ideally we don't want that to happen at all. So real benefit for the second interconnector. If we now start to think about different technologies and different types of renewables, these graphs illustrate what the solar potential is of the Isle of Man. Top left is daylight hours. So if you think the longer the day is, the more power you can produce from solar. The second graph down is temperature. Temperature actually adversely affects what you can generate from solar. The higher the temperature, the lower the efficiency of the solar panels. But on the Isle of Man, our temperature range is fairly consistent between winter and summer. So we've got a better opportunity to generate from solar in summer than many places. And the graph on the bottom left-hand side is the solar irradiance delivered by area. So the higher the angle of the sun in the sky, the more concentrated the rays are on the panels and the more power you can generate from solar in that area. The sun is highest in summer, so most of the power we can generate from solar happens in summer. And in terms of solar potential across the island, the map on the right side shows the solar potential in terms of location. So you can see the top right of the island, Bride area or Andres area, has a really, really good potential for solar. And the middle of the area or the middle of the island is less suitable. Still pretty good. We could still maybe generate 9% of our power from solar per year by having solar panels in that area of the grid. It's affected by clouds and fog, though, more so than other areas, and topography and shading. And again, southern area of the grid is fairly good for solar, but not quite so good as the northern area. I suppose the key thing, though, is that the scale on the bottom part, there is very little difference, even with that in mind, between any areas of the island. So the real important issue for solar is the strength of the power system in the areas where you're trying to develop it. This graph just shows what the difference is in solar generation and solar output when you have clouds going over. So on a clear day, you have a very uniform profile of generation, some spikes that are caused by temperature issues, but that changes if you have passing cloud cover. So clouds reduce the output almost instantaneously if they pass over a solar panel. So we have to, from a grid perspective, be able to balance those intermittent spikes in power. And just to recap how that solar then compares to demand, top left graph is the comparison of 20 megawatts of solar power relative to demand in summer. Fairly well matched, although it completely misses the evening peak. But in winter, we're only generating around 15% of what we could generate in summer from solar. So it is not meeting the largest peak in demand we have on island in winter. It's not covering or meeting our demand requirements at all, really, in winter, barring around 12 o'clock in the day. And the graph on the right-hand side shows the difference between the annual output of solar panels relative to annual demand. So the relationship is completely contradictory. It doesn't really support us. We generate a lot more than we need from solar in summer, and we don't generate enough for what we need in winter. Wind is quite the opposite story. So the wind potential on the Isle of Man is actually much higher in winter than it is in summer. We have the ability to generate power from wind at all times across the year, but it is highest in winter. And if we now look at the dominant wind direction on islands, typically the wind either comes from the south or the west on the island. So overriding profile is southwesterly winds. And the map on the right-hand side shows the areas of the island where the wind speeds are the highest. It's a no-brainer. It is the upland areas, but specifically the upland areas which face the southwesterly direction have a much better potential than other areas because they've got access to that dominant wind direction, and it's also very, very windy. This graph shows the difference between wind speed and power output from a wind generator. Wind speed varies quite a lot, but because the generator is rotating, it takes a lot of that variance out of it. So the output of a wind turbine is a lot smoother than the wind speed profile. But we still have to be able to balance the gaps and dips in in output. And now if we look how wind compares to demand, the daily demand on the top this time is the winter profile. So 20 megawatts of wind, barring some gaps when it's very, very windy or not windy enough, can consistently generate around 20 megawatts across the day, which is great because it covers that evening peak. In summer, a 20 megawatt generator can still generate 20 megawatts of output, so it will still meet the demand profile. And you can see on the graph on the right-hand side that the annual demand and the annual wind production are very, very well matched for that technology. So it's a really good fit for the Isle of Man, a lot better fit than solar. So in terms of what we're moving forward with our renewable projects, we had a site selection done by Bureau Veritas in 2022. They looked at 32 sites or found 32 sites on the public estate that were suitable for renewable generation, either wind or solar. In total, we identified 30 megawatts potential solar capacity from public buildings. That would actually be far too much power for what we need on island because demand in summer just is not high enough. So we don't need to do that much. 5 of those buildings or car parks alone were suitable for between 1 and 2 megawatts. So that's massive potential. It will be some of the largest installations on brownfield sites in the UK or British Isles. 21 of the sites were just under 0.5 megawatts. So to put that in perspective, the largest installation on island at this point today is the Mountain View Innovation Centre. I think they've just got over 250 kilowatts. So we're talking about double what they've got on to meet that. 3 of the sites were suitable for onshore wind, and at the time there were some limitations around the site boundaries for those areas, but we could generate 30 megawatts in total from what had been identified in that study. So quick overview of the solar project. Because of the strength of the grid, we're concentrating in the Douglas area for our first rollout. We're targeting the NSC, Nobles Hospital and the sea terminal. They are the largest areas in Douglas, which are brownfield sites. Moving on to stage 2, the second phase will be concentrated in the central and southern areas of the island. That gives us time to strengthen the grid where we need to. And finally, moving into stage 3, we will be looking at northern areas of the island and central sites as well. If we installed everything and everything was exactly as designed, we could potentially hit 12.4 megawatt peak by the end of 2026 from those installations, but we are assuming that we are going to lose some areas of solar panel development. So just to show you what that typically might look at, this is the outline of the NSC. So you can see there's a combination of rooftop and car park solar at that site. So the rooftop solar is typically covering the flatter areas of the roof, which are south facing, and the car parks are raised, or the car park solar panels are raised and mounted, so you can still use it for parking. And we're working with the Department of Education, Sport and Culture on exactly where we locate those panels to optimise their activities as well. In total, we could generate around 1.3 megawatts from that site, so really significant. If we now look at the other sites we've got, so if we were to just place solar panels in Nobles in that area of the development, we could hit around 1.4 megawatts, so really significant. But actually, that whole site is owned by the government estate or public estate, so it's got much greater potential for what's already been looked at. So that's going to come out of the design stage. The sea terminal, that is the area that we could be looking at. So not necessarily installing panels over the whole site. We're doing some work at the moment with DOI, looking at King Edward the 8th Pier. Hopefully the new canopy of or the new canopy and entrance into the Manx will have solar panels on top of it by the end of next year. So looking forward to our onshore wind farm project, there's some key issues or key criteria we have to consider when selecting sites that are suitable for wind. Key one is wind speed. If a site doesn't have wind speeds above 6 metres per second, it's not economically viable. So we are really limited to upland areas, typically on the Isle of Man, to where we see those wind speeds. Noise, we typically have to ensure that any wind turbine noise produced is lower than 35 decibel average in somebody's garden near the wind turbine site, which typically requires us to leave around 500 metres between a wind turbine and somebody's property. Ecological impact, we're currently carrying out or have to carry out different levels of ecological assessments as we move forwards, and that considers some key constraints. So one of the key things we have to consider as a public body is we have a commitment to ensure net biodiversity gain with all of our projects. And it's challenging on some areas of the island where we have a really, really high biodiversity value habitat like heathland, because if you damage heathland, you can't necessarily repair it within 100 years. So it's quite hard to gain that net biodiversity gain standard. So we've had to avoid heathland broadly. We also have to consider topography and access, so whether or not you can actually deploy wind turbines on certain areas of the island. Snaefell's got really, really high wind speeds, but the topography doesn't necessarily allow you to deploy wind turbines up there, and it's not got great grid access or road access either. We have to consider radar and aviation, so it's not a hard stopper, but we are working with the airport to make sure that there's no impact to safety or any of the aircraft in the way they operate. And finally, network access, big consideration. So if we think back to that map of the island and the island's power system, we have to locate renewables, we have to locate the wind farms where we've actually got the ability for the grid to take that power. So site selection that was done and ongoing by Wardle Armstrong. types of things that they've looked at: average wind speeds across the Isle of Man and the dominant wind direction, avoiding precious habitat like heathland, which really limits which sites we can look at when you compare those two maps. And finally, the topography of the Isle of Man. So is the land too steep to actually put wind turbines on it in certain areas? And then if you start to consider the location of the power system, that really narrows down where you can locate wind turbines. So broadly, there are 3 areas that aren't heathland, have good connection to the power system, are uplands and have high enough wind speeds. So those are the 3 broad areas, and because we have to move forward with delivering this, we have focused on the public-owned sites in those 3 areas for delivery. So comparisons of the sites at this point in time. The third site, which is Baldwin and Ingerbreck, has an excellent plateau where you could locate a really big wind farm. It's got really, really good wind speeds, but unfortunately the topography to access that plateau limits any vehicle being able to put wind turbines up there. So at that site, we'd be limited to only 3 megawatts of wind turbines. So it was ruled out really quickly. The other 2 sites, Selby and Druridale, really good wind speeds, over 8.5 metres per second. But due to access, we would have to install between 7 and 12 turbines there. We can't get the larger turbines to that site. But it's got good annual generation potential, over 80 gigawatt hours per year, which, given our annual demand is 350 gigawatt hours, it's quite impressive. And it's enough to save 45 kilotons of CO2 per year. So a significant chunk of our emissions. The site in the south of the island, Eriestown and Skird, can generate 20 megawatts. The wind speeds are a lot higher at that site, over 10 metres per second from what we know. But because we have better access to the site, we can get larger turbines there. We'd only need to deploy 4 to 5 turbines to meet our 20 megawatt capacity. And we could generate between 100 and 130 gigawatt hours per year from that site because the wind speeds are higher. So we're continuing to do some work on the ecological, to understand the ecological impact and transport access, and that work is currently in progress. So finally, just to summarise our future energy plan, there's sort of 3 areas that we think align with the broader energy policy outcomes. So the first one is solving the energy trilemma. So back to how we're going to meet that balance of affordability, security of supply, and the environment. If we do an installation of a new interconnector, we have some dispatchable generation to maintain power if we ever take the interconnector out for outage, and do some peak lopping support, and also install our 10 megawatts of solar and 20 megawatts of wind. We believe we've met that balance. It's an optimised level of renewables on the island, it's in line with current demand, and it will maintain affordable electricity on the island as well as security of supply. We also have the option to connect into an offshore wind farm later down the line. So post 2030, if we connect into an offshore wind farm, we have the potential to generate 90% of all of the power we need on island from that wind farm. Because if you think 1 gigawatt wind farm out there, even if it was only ever generating 10% of its power needs on any given day, that's still enough to meet our island demand no matter the time of year. We'd also need to have the support of our on-demand generators, but if we have that wind farm and our plan, then 100% of our power could be coming from Isle of Man generators within the next decade. And the last one is, the last leg is about securing future opportunities. So working with the private sector to identify routes to market outside of the Isle of Man. We know that island demand is not quite high enough to have some sort of energy market on the island at this point in time, but it doesn't rule out export into other markets. So if a private developer can find a route to market, we'll work with them, we'll assist and look to support them exporting that in the future. And I'm just going to leave the energy transition roadmap up there just to finish, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to Steve Foden. I called him Foden before. Steve Foden for his time before. He is around, as he said, during the day. If you catch him, if you want to have a chat with him, our officers will be around as well. Thank you especially to Lizzie. There's an awful lot of information there for you to digest. It is on our website, I believe. So if you want to have a look, and then by all means come back. So a lot of you have been coming back to us, and we're very grateful for that, so we can answer some of those questions. What we try to do when they come in, we collate them all, so we're not all the time not sending you one, Lizzie sending you one, Adrian sending you one. So we do collate them, and we try and send them back to you. It takes a few days, but we try and get there. We are trying our best to answer your questions. We know you are concerned about what's going on. We absolutely know you're concerned. We've got a short period now for question time, so I'm going to ask Lizzie, God love her, to come back up here. Adrian and Phil, if you want to come back up and join us as well on stage. And we'll take a few questions. We are, as everybody's busy, I think we'll get through these as quick as we can, so we'll try and keep them fairly short, if you like. Say some of us can stay, some of them have got to go back. I'll be around all day, but others have got to go back to work for meetings and stuff. So if you can just give us your name, please, and when we start. But sir.
My name's Julian. I'm a bit confused about your numbers. You had a slide that showed 35% capacity factor for onshore, but you're also saying that Erie State would yield 100 to 130 gigawatt hours, which would indicate 53 to 72%. Now, there is a website from the consortium of Ørsted, RWE, the largest energy provider in the UK, called renewableuk.com. And they're indicating 32% across all on and offshore in the fleet, but they need 3.5 times more onshore than offshore, which works out at 18%. And some of the MHKs are talking about a 74% yield. But if Ørsted's own website is indicating you're talking up Erie State by 4 times compared to what Ørsted says they're getting from the UK fleet, how does that work?
Yes, it's actually quite simple when you think about it. So if you look at the stats from BEIS, the average onshore wind farm will produce 35% across the year. So that's all sites across the UK, not the highest, not the best potential. There's currently an offshore wind farm in the UK that has a capacity factor of 65%, which is Highview. That's in Scotland. But the real limitation, or the real reason why capacity factor is low in the UK, is actually the ability to export that power into the UK grid. So UK at times has far too much wind for their demand, and they have to curtail it, which then reduces the capacity factor. Because we're only installing 20 megawatts, we're never likely to curtail that wind power. We wouldn't need to do it.
If they're measuring now, where does this figure come from of 74% that's been bandied around?
So that is off what's called the Renewable wind model analysis. So there's a global data set of wind speeds across the whole of the globe, and that shows the Isle of Man's got really, really good wind potential. It's not the first study that's said it. There's been 50 years worth of data saying the Isle of Man's got excellent potential. And we've also got historic data from MEA records for that area of the island, which are also showing very, very high wind speeds in that area. But we have to do some validation. So the thing that is most of a concern is actually really, really high wind speeds. So that's what we don't see from the average wind yield. So and I can tell you this, in the last couple of days, we've recorded a wind speed at that site above 30 metres per second, which is absolutely massive. It's unsurprising. It's been super, super windy. But that's the detail that we don't see in an average, and that impacts on how we design it to be able to withstand any issues in that area.
Last part of the question, why are you not measuring in Druidale at the same time in the same year? How are you going to compare next year with this year? Does that not mean that's a 1-year study, but you need 2 years? Because you're doing 1 year in one and 1 year in another, but you can't compare 2 years.
Yep, so the devices that we can get hold of, the SODAR devices, are really, really hard to come by. So we are doing an environmental impact assessment over 2 years. That gives us enough time to collect data in both of those areas of the network. But actually, in order to make a decision, we don't require that measurement to move forwards. It's actually the models that would allow us or give us enough granularity to make that decision. So the benefit of measuring it, as I've just said, is about the design of wind turbines and making sure that your design is robust enough to be able to withstand the highest wind speeds that you see at a site. It's not about which site you pick.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Behind, yes. You, sir, yeah.
Brian.
Hi, Brian.
How you doing? All right. I was just wondering why all the lights are on in here today. Could we have saved some electric here for a start? We could have managed it in the dark with the screens, couldn't we? That's for a start. But there's been no mention of cost in your presentation. What is it going to cost? Have you got figures? And can we afford it?
The cost is out there. It was mentioned between 30 and 40 million pounds. And
that's a guess. That's a guess.
It's an educated guess, but I mean, it depends between the two sites, obviously. And we heard that one site, you know, if we were to use the upper site up at Druidale, obviously there's more turbines to go up there, so that's going to be it is going to be dearer to deliver those up there than it would be down to Erie Stane for sure.
But surely surely the interconnector is the best option. Surely
that's part and parcel of the answer to all of this, and that will go in as part of the answer. But it is between 30 and 40 million pounds for the wind turbines.
That's a guess.
No, it's
28 million. The landing stage at Liverpool, wasn't it? Where's that now? 130 million.
Yeah. But it's a figure that's been worked out by Wardle and Armstrong at the moment, between 30 and 40 million pounds. And it's an ongoing piece of work, Brian. As you know, they're still working on the schemes at the moment. They're doing the transport, they're doing the ecologies and all sorts. So those figures, you know,
but surely we, the Manx public, should actually know the figure and maybe decide on which direction you take.
As soon as
you politicians here, you'll be gone in 3 years' time. You see, won't you?
As soon as we have those, as soon as we pick a site, let's put it that way, because we'll have a much better idea then on the cost, because obviously one's more than the other. But we'll come back with those figures as soon as we can tie them down.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Philip Jenkins. You said earlier on in your piece that you would not be putting these on Heathland. Is that correct?
Correct, yes, I think it was. Yes?
Yeah, so the Heathland mapping has already been done for the Isle of Man.
Right. So why are you putting it on Heathland? Because the plantation is a plantation, a failed plantation, which has now got a fantastic biodiversity if you care to look through it. It is Heathland. There is no denying it. You've got I think it was the DEFA report from 2010 that states it was Heathland. So why are you still carrying on down that road when you've got the data already there? You shouldn't have spent any money on this site at all because it's Heathland. It needs to stop at that point. You've got 8 or 9 endangered species on that area.
So at the moment, we have an ongoing environmental impact assessment, which was started last week. And they are looking at everything that's on there, including the heathland. Peatland, we absolutely don't touch. We all know that. We don't touch the peatland. But it comes down to a lot of the mitigation that we can do on these. Lizzie will probably explain that a bit better than I can. But there is a lot of it can be mitigated, but it depends on how much has to be done. If it's too much, like you say, we can't do it. And that's what the impact assessment is all about. If there's anything there that says we cannot do this on that site or the other site up north, we can't do it, and we're back to square one. We all know that, but we have to spend money on those impact assessments.
You're stating in your piece you don't put them on Heathland.
But that's what I'm saying about the mitigation, though.
But it is Heathland. If you look at your map, you can see that there's a direct line where the plantation is. On the map, you've got a line across, and that's where the trees were planted.
So we have DEFA is involved, they're part of our working groups, and that's not the feedback we're getting from DEFA, but we do have surveys in place. So one of the things that is quite important is the consistency of what you find at a site. So for example, we know that there is a lot of peatland at Solby and Druidale, and we don't want to build on we don't want to build on peat. But it's not consistently spread across the site. So it is possible to put turbines on the Druridale site without actually impacting the peatland that is there. You can avoid it. And that's why it's really, really important to get that detail done from our surveys, which are ongoing.
Lizzie, you said in your speech earlier that 100% you would not build on heathland because it wouldn't be carbon neutral for 100 years. What in your Bureau Veritas report, it states that they use the Man GIS mapping, the online mapping for their desktop study. And in that report, it shows that there is a plantation. And that's because the Man GIS system doesn't show the layers of heathland that are covered in plantation. And that is the ultimate flaw in this, that if you look at the Man GIS system, and I recommend everybody goes and looks at it online, you'll see that the heathland is one colour and plantations is another. And you don't specify a layer for plantations over heathland. Everybody knows that that is heathland. Everybody.
So we haven't just looked at the Man GIS, that was what we used to identify it, and we've had consultants on the ground in the field actually looking at that site and mapping it, what's on the ground and what is there. So we have got that feedback in. It's not just that we're relying on it, and we certainly wouldn't have announced anything if that had been the case and what they'd found from that initial overview.
You haven't announced that you've moved to stage 2, but it's obvious to all the residents that you have moved to stage 2. And stage 2 is your environmental impact assessment. You haven't spoken to residents, and it's very clear that you've got a total disregard for everybody in that location. The question that I did want to ask is, please validate your assertions that the sites selected are in the best interests of the island consumers and the taxpayers by delivering the lowest cost, highest value, because you stated that you'd only looked at sites that were in public ownership.
So we've got a Tynwald answer and we've got a written question that is in the public domain, and it's clear that we haven't just looked at sites that is in the public domain. That initial study that was by Bureau Veritas narrowed it down to 3 areas of the island and then looked at deploying turbines on sites that were owned in the public domain. So it's not true that we haven't looked at the whole of the island, and that work has been done. But in terms of validating it, we haven't decided that we're building a wind farm anywhere at this point in time. We've decided that we need to do further work, and that work is what is ongoing. As part of that work, there will be public consultation and public engagement, and we certainly can't move forward. We can't get to the point where we go to a planning application before we've done that piece of work. So that is what we are working on at the moment, and we can't, as you say, we certainly aren't validating it or moving forwards without doing that extra piece of work. All we're committing to is doing further work.
Okay, thank you. Can I get this gentleman over here?
Hello. Yeah, Lee Morris, CEO of Manx Wildlife Trust. So, as the CEO of Manx Wildlife Trust, I just want to applaud the fact that we're even having these conversations. So we're really enthused about the conversation about renewables, and we do trust that the government will do ecological assessments and full planning process robustly, and then we'll be right with you. It'd be great. My one question really is around the timescale. Having had conversations about offshore wind and understanding the Gantt charts and the robust stages that go through that take many years, how can we do this by 2026 and do it well? I'd be great if we could, but I just want to be reassured that that 2026 date that was put up there is really doable for us.
It's certainly a very, very tight timescale, as we've said when we've had meetings with the commissioners and that. We absolutely understand that. It's put the staff under a lot of pressure to deliver this, but there is absolutely a system to go through, as anybody that's been through the planning system knows, and we have to go through that system. This has to be done properly. It has to be done right with all the impact assessments and everything else that goes with it. If it fails, and that's all there is to it. But we have to go through the proper system. There is no sliding sideways or missing anything out here. It absolutely can't be done. Thank you. Gentleman at the back.
Yes, my name is John Shepherd. I'm Technical Director of the Manx company Wren Sustainable. We're sustainability consultants. I'm deeply concerned about the whole way in which the Isle of Man government is currently managing the whole issue of sustainability and a drive towards carbon neutral. To give you a background of what we've done, February last year we completed what we believe are a pair of the most sustainable, affordable houses to the Swedish passive house system in the British Isles. To show you exactly how efficient, with the off-peak rate of 9.6p, the total cost of the off-peak usage in the first year of our living in the house for heating, hot water and other usage was £372. Now, okay, the rate for the off-peak has now pretty much doubled, so it's gone up. We've also developed methods using the Swedish passive house system whereby we can achieve passive in virtually any house on the Isle of Man very affordably with using existing heating systems, focusing mainly on the unexplored issue of the greatest area of loss from housing, which is through natural ventilation. By installing very simple and very inexpensive ventilation heat recovery systems, that can be massive. You can massively reduce the energy usage. In terms of generation, I am concerned that the Manx Utilities have not focused more closely on old water mills and the use of potential water times, most particularly the Miri Veg plant. Effectively, in 2010, the third year energy group came over from Exeter University and did a massive report on the energy potential of the Isle of Man, which has been largely ignored by the Isle of Man government. Effectively, they showed that at the time, for less than £1 million, a turbine could have been put on the 60-foot outfall from the Miri Veg plant, which would have paid for itself at that then rate of generation within 2 years. Now, obviously, with the level of the cost of electric at the moment and the fact that, you know, it's not particularly going to come down given the energy crisis that we currently have across the world, which is only going to worsen. I just don't understand why the Manx Utilities are not focusing more on the potential, particularly with existing old water mills where all the infrastructure still exists. And effectively, you could put in micro turbines that would massively improve the amount of sustainable energy that we generated in the island.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Is anybody, Adrian?
Well, I think we are aware of that study. I'm not sure it generated or suggested it would be a solution to our island energy demands. You know, if you look at the flows of our rivers and our catchments, I don't believe they're capable of solving the problem. And another thing that Lizzie's sort of referenced quite frequently in her presentation is access to the grid and, you know, taking energy effectively from rural areas and bringing them back to the centres of population is not an easy thing either. That's not, I mean, we've built, just naturally, I suppose, through years of development, a vertically integrated power system. You know, it's based on a central production methodology and taking that energy out to the masses. Yeah, I mean, we obviously do try and look at what we can do in terms of saving energy. You know, if we refer to something we're hoping to deliver in Garth with our sewage treatment works, we're going to try, when returning the clean water back to the sea, to recover energy from that. But you need actually quite a lot of height to actually create energy or electricity that's worth utilising.
Yeah, if I just come on that point as well, we did some work on turbulent hydro back in 2020 now, and there's only 2 rivers on the Isle of Man which actually have constant flow through them. One is the Neb in Peel, and the other one is Solby River. Solby's already got a hydro generator on it, and Peel, the flow rate is not high enough given what they're going to have to do with the flood infrastructure improvements in there to accommodate more than around 150 kilowatts. And what we're talking about for our needs is, you know, at least 75 megawatts. So we're an order of magnitude out. But you know, any efficiency improvements we can do, we are looking at them constantly, and that's another action on us from the climate plan, but not part of future energy.
I think I would agree with you. I think one of the, you know, if Steve was still in the room, overall, solving our energy needs has to include making our housing stock more efficient, and it certainly has to be something has to be done within the transport sector. You know, Steve would be able to speak better about those 2 factors than we are. But certainly I understand that Manx government are looking at developing policy in that area.
Give me two. Give me two more. There's a lady at the back. Sorry, Kiwi, just behind you. Oh, it's Anne? Yeah. Good morning.
Good morning, Annie Reynolds.
Good morning. Good to see you.
Hi, Annie. Long time no see.
Yeah, been ducking and diving. You know what it's like.
Yeah.
Easy question for you. What's the cost of installing a second interconnector?
We can answer what's in the public domain already. So from ARUP, there was an estimate of upwards to around £200 million for a second interconnector. WSP have given us another figure of around £140 million for that second interconnector. So that guarantees security of supply, but there's then the additional cost on top of that for any imported electricity.
Okay, thank you. I think you, sir, for the last question. Do you have it?
It's my favourite question as a geologist. So typically when you're looking at geothermal for electricity potential, you are looking at areas which have a lot of very, very hot steam. And I don't just mean hot in the sense of we can drill down and there's a lot of warm water down there, which is great for heating. We're talking about superheated steam. So of the British Isles, the only areas of the British Isles which have really got potential for geothermal are areas which have old igneous intrusions, not volcanoes really, but the things you get inside mountains that stay hot for a very, very long period of time. Cornwall has the hottest. It's got the best potential in the British Isles. As of yet, even though they've investigated it heavily and spent millions investigating that in Cornwall, they have not been able to generate superheated steam. So they currently can't generate electricity, but it's absolutely fantastic for heating if you've got it. Oldest similar region on the Isle of Man, though, is a lot older than even Cornwall, so our heating potential is nowhere near as good. So if Cornwall can't do it, we're going to struggle to do it. There's work ongoing looking at things called deep well geothermal, which is if you drill really, really deep into the Earth's crust, but then that's got a very, very high cost to it. So it's currently not commercially viable. But obviously, as our roadmap shows, post-2030, we're looking into loads more options. And if it becomes commercially viable, we will absolutely look into that technology.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've been told to wrap up down here. Thank you very, very much indeed for your time and attendance this morning. We absolutely appreciate how important this is, not only to the island, but to localities. We will be in touch with you again when we have information to give out. Please keep in touch with us. Yeah, we will answer your questions when you've got them. Please email them in to us. Thank you very much indeed. Have a good day. All the best.